The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop outside Winslow, Arizona territory, throwing Natalie Thompson against the wooden door hard enough to bruise her shoulder. And as she stumbled out into the scorching June heat of 1878, clutching her torn dress and the ripped half of a map that was supposed to lead her to her future husband's ranch, she wondered if crossing half the country to marry a stranger had been the worst decision of her life. Dust swirled around her worn boots as she stood alone on the dirt road, watching the stagecoach disappear toward the next town. The driver had insisted this was her stop, though nothing about the sprawling desert landscape matched the detailed instructions she'd received 3 months ago in Philadelphia. Those instructions were now useless, the bottom half of the map torn away when her trunk had caught on a nail during the journey. All she had left were fragments of directions and a name: Lawrence Thornton, cattleman, 3 miles northwest of Winslow. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Natalie shaded her eyes with one gloved hand, squinting at the buildings lining the dusty street. Winslow wasn't much to look at, a collection of weathered wooden structures and adobe buildings that seemed to shimmer in the heat. A saloon, a general store, what looked like a hotel, and various other establishments she couldn't quite make out. Nothing like the ordered streets and brick buildings of Philadelphia she'd left behind. She clutched her carpet bag tighter, feeling the weight of everything she owned pressing against her palm. 23 years old and reduced to this, a stranger in a strange land, holding half a map and a fading hope that the man who'd sent for her actually existed. The correspondence had seemed genuine enough. Lawrence Thornton's letters had been simple but kind, describing his cattle ranch, his need for a wife to help build a life in the territory, his promise of security and respect. She'd answered his advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper, because staying in Philadelphia meant becoming a burden to her sister's growing family or accepting work in the textile mills that had already claimed her mother's health. This had seemed like the better choice. Now, she wasn't so sure. Natalie picked up her small trunk, grateful she'd sold most of her possessions before the journey, and started walking toward the general store. Someone there might know Lawrence Thornton, or at least point her in the right direction. Her feet ached from days of travel, and her green traveling dress was stained with dust and sweat, despite her best efforts to stay presentable. She'd wanted to make a good first impression on her intended husband. That hope seemed laughable now. The general store's door creaked when she pushed it open, and the relative coolness inside was such a relief she paused just over the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from flour sacks to rope coils, and the smell of tobacco and leather filled the air. An older woman behind the counter looked up from a ledger, her weathered face breaking into a curious smile. "Help you, miss?" "I'm looking for the Thornton Ranch," Natalie said, stepping forward. "I was told it's 3 miles northwest of town, but I'm afraid my directions were damaged during the journey." She held up the torn map as evidence. The woman's eyes widened slightly. "You're the mail-order bride." "We heard Lawrence sent for someone, though most folks figured you'd change your mind once you saw how far from civilization we are out here." Natalie felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature. Of course the whole town would know her business. "I gave my word I'd come." "Could you tell me how to reach the ranch?" Before the shopkeeper could answer, the door opened behind Natalie, and she turned to see a man entering. He was tall, probably in his late 20s, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of wheat stubble. His clothes were dusty from travel, worn denim, and a shirt that might have been blue once but had faded to a pale gray. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in this harsh landscape, and when his eyes met hers, She saw they were an unexpected shade of hazel, green and brown mixing together. "Lawrence," the shopkeeper said, "this young lady was just asking after you." The man's expression shifted from mild curiosity to something harder to read. Surprise, certainly, but also a flash of what might have been concern or even guilt. "Miss Thompson?" "Yes." Natalie tried to stand straighter despite her exhaustion. "I apologize for my appearance. The journey was difficult and my trunk was damaged, which tore the map you sent. I've only just arrived." Lawrence Thornton removed his hat, revealing hair pressed flat with sweat. He turned the brim in his hands, a nervous gesture that didn't match his otherwise assured bearing. "I didn't think you'd actually come." The words hit her like a physical blow. "You invited me. We've been corresponding for 3 months. I sold everything I own to make this journey. I know, I just—" He glanced at the shopkeeper, then back at Natalie. "Could we speak outside?" Natalie's heart was pounding now, a mixture of anger and fear making her voice sharper than she intended. "If you've changed your mind, you can say so right here. I'm not fragile, Mr. Thornton. It's not that." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Please. Just give me a few minutes to explain." The shopkeeper was watching with undisguised interest, and Natalie realized whatever happened next would be town gossip by sunset. She nodded curtly and followed Lawrence back outside into the brutal heat. He led her to a small patch of shade beside the building, where a water trough and hitching post stood. "I wrote those letters," Lawrence began, setting his hat back on his head. "Every word was true. I do have a ranch and I do need help running it. But 3 weeks ago, I received word that my brother and his wife died of fever back in Texas. They left behind 2 children, a boy and a girl, ages 6 and 4. I brought them here, and now everything's changed." Natalie tried to process this information through her fatigue. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I don't understand what that has to do with me." "Taking on someone else's children is a lot to ask," Lawrence said. "More than I had any right to expect from someone I've never met. I wrote you a letter explaining the situation and releasing you from our agreement, but you must have already left Philadelphia by the time it arrived. So you thought I'd just show up and you'd send me back?" Natalie demanded. "Mr. Thornton, I have no home to return to. I gave up my room, sold my mother's furniture, spent everything I had on the journey here. Even if I wanted to go back, I couldn't afford the fare." Lawrence's jaw tightened. "I wouldn't leave you stranded. I'd pay your way back east, naturally, and give you enough to get settled again. I'm not trying to cheat you." "How generous," Natalie said, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. She turned away, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. She'd prepared herself for many possibilities: a rough living rancher, a harsh climate, hard work, even the chance that Lawrence Thornton would be unkind or difficult. She hadn't prepared for simple rejection. "Miss Thompson," his voice had softened. "Natalie, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to be honest. Those children have lost everything. They're scared and grieving, and they don't know me from Adam. My brother and I hadn't spoken in years before the letter came about his death. Bringing a stranger into that situation, asking you to help raise children who aren't yours, it seemed unfair to everyone involved." Natalie took a slow breath, forcing herself to think past her wounded pride. She turned back to face him. "What are their names?" "What? The children?" "What are their names?" Lawrence hesitated. "Thomas and Sarah. Tommy's 6, Sarah just turned 4. And who's caring for them now? My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. She's got 5 of her own, and she's been kind about taking on 2 more, but I can't impose on her forever." He rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. "Her husband works for me, and they've got enough to handle without adding my problems to the mix." Natalie set down her carpetbag and faced Lawrence squarely. I grew up helping my sister raise her children. I know how to cook and clean and manage a household. I'm good with children, patient and gentle. I can teach them to read and write. Those are all things you mentioned needing in your letters, and they're still true whether the children are yours by blood or responsibility. Nothing about the situation has actually changed what you need, Mr. Thornton. But it changes what I'm asking you to take on, Lawrence insisted. Does it? Natalie met his eyes directly. You wanted a partner to help build a life out here. Those children need a home and stability. I need a place to belong. It seems to me like everyone's needs align pretty well. Lawrence stared at her for a long moment, and she saw him truly looking at her for the first time, taking in her determined expression, the set of her shoulders, the intelligence in her eyes. You'd really stay? Knowing you'd be helping raise my brother's children. I'd stay on one condition, Natalie said firmly. You treat me as an equal partner in this arrangement, not as hired help or a burden you're tolerating. We agreed to build a life together, and that means respecting each other and making decisions together. Can you do that? Something shifted in Lawrence's expression, a kind of guarded hope. Yes, madam, I can do that. Then you have yourself a deal, Mr. Thornton. Natalie held out her hand, and after a moment's surprise, he shook it. His grip was firm but careful, his palm calloused from hard work. Now, you mentioned your ranch is 3 miles northwest. I assume you have a wagon or horse nearby. A ghost of a smile crossed Lawrence's face. I've got a wagon at the livery. Let me collect my supplies from the store and we'll head out. Fair warning, the place isn't much to look at yet. My brother homesteaded it 5 years ago, built a cabin and started running cattle. I've only been here 6 months myself, trying to build it up. As long as it has a roof and walls, it's more than some people have, Natalie said practically. She was too tired to care about appearances anymore. She just wanted to sit down somewhere that wasn't moving. They went back into the general store together, and Natalie waited while Lawrence completed his purchases, loading sacks of flour, coffee, sugar, and various other supplies into crates. The shopkeeper kept shooting curious glances between them, clearly dying to know what had been decided. Mrs. Patterson, this is my fiancée, Natalie Thompson, Lawrence said as he paid for his goods. We'll be married as soon as the circuit judge comes through town. Could you spread the word we're looking for a preacher in the meantime if one happens through? Mrs. Patterson's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Of course. How wonderful. We don't get many new brides out here, Miss Thompson. You'll have to come to the next church social once you're settled. The ladies will want to welcome you properly. Natalie managed a smile, though the word fiancé had caught her off guard. She'd expected the marriage to happen immediately, a practical arrangement concluded quickly. The idea of waiting, of having time to actually get to know Lawrence Thornton before legally binding herself to him, was both relieving and unsettling. Lawrence carried her trunk easily, and she followed him down the street to the livery stable, where a sturdy wagon and 2 horses waited. He loaded the supplies with efficient movements, years of practice evident in how he distributed the weight and secured everything with rope. Then he helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand steady under her elbow. The touch, brief as it was, reminded her sharply that this man was meant to be her husband. She'd been so focused on the practical aspects of survival that she hadn't let herself really think about what marriage meant. Sharing a home, a life, eventually a bed. Her cheeks heated, and she was grateful when Lawrence climbed up beside her and focused his attention on the horses. They rode in silence for the first mile, leaving Winslow behind and heading into open country. The landscape was unlike anything Natalie had ever seen, vast and empty, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional twisted tree. Mountains rose in the distance, purple and blue against the endless sky. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. "I know this must all be strange to you," Lawrence said finally, not looking at her. "Coming from a city to this emptiness." "Philadelphia has its own kind of emptiness," Natalie replied. "Crowded streets full of people who don't see you. At least here, if you're alone, it's honest about it." He glanced at her, something like understanding in his expression. "Your letters mentioned you'd lost your mother. Was it recent?" "2 years ago. She worked in the textile mills, and the air there destroys your lungs eventually. My sister tried to take me in, but her husband made it clear I wasn't really welcome. I was teaching at a small school, but the pay was barely enough to keep a room. When I saw your advertisement, it seemed like Providence." She smoothed her skirt, the fabric dusty beyond redemption. "A chance to start fresh, to have a real home again." "I understand that feeling," Lawrence said quietly. "My brother and I grew up on a ranch in Texas, but after our parents died, we couldn't agree on how to run it. He wanted to sell and move west, start over. I wanted to keep working the land our father had built. We fought about it until he finally left, and we didn't speak for 8 years. Then I got the letter that he was dead, and there were 2 orphan children who needed family. So you left Texas." "Sold my share of the ranch to my cousin and came here. Figured I could honor my brother's memory by finishing what he started, building something good out here." He guided the horses around a rough patch of ground. "Didn't expect it to be so damn hard, pardon my language." "Hard how?" Lawrence was quiet for a moment. "Tommy won't talk to me. He just stares like I'm a stranger he's been forced to tolerate. Sarah cries for her mother every night, and I don't know how to help them because I barely knew their father anymore, and I never met their mother at all. I'm just the uncle who showed up after everything fell apart." Natalie heard the frustration and grief in his voice. "They need time. Children understand loss, but they process it differently than adults. Be patient, be consistent, and they'll come around. You sound pretty certain about that." "My sister's oldest son lost his best friend to scarlet fever when he was 7. He didn't speak for 2 months, just sat by the window and stared outside. Everyone said he needed to snap out of it, that grieving too long wasn't healthy. But I sat with him every day and let him be quiet. Eventually, he started talking again, little things at first, then more. You can't rush grief." Lawrence nodded slowly. "I'll remember that." The ranch came into view over the next rise, and Natalie felt her stomach drop slightly. Lawrence had said it wasn't much, and he'd been honest. The cabin was small, maybe 3 rooms total, built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. A barn stood behind it, and several corrals held cattle that looked up incuriously as the wagon approached. Everything was functional but sparse, the bones of a homestead that needed years of work to become truly prosperous. A woman emerged from the cabin as they pulled up, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair streaked with gray and a kind, weathered face. 2 children appeared in the doorway behind her, a boy with serious dark eyes and a little girl clinging to his hand. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Lawrence called, setting the brake. "Thank you for watching them." "It is no trouble, Mr. Thornton." Mrs. Rodriguez's accent was musical, her English precise. She looked at Natalie with open curiosity. "This is your bride, Natalie Thompson," Lawrence said, climbing down and then offering Natalie his hand. "Natalie, this is Carla Rodriguez. Her husband Diego works as my foreman, and she's been a godsend these past weeks." Natalie smiled at the woman. "Thank you for caring for the children. I'm sure it's been an imposition." "Those little ones are no trouble," Mrs. Rodriguez said warmly, "but they will be glad to be home, I think. They are shy in a strange house." Natalie turned her attention to the children still hovering in the doorway. Thomas was tall for 6, all skinny limbs and wary eyes. Sarah was tiny, clutching a rag doll with yarn hair, Neither child smiled or came forward. "Tommy, Sarah," Lawrence said gently. "This is Miss Natalie. She's going to be living here with us, helping take care of things." Thomas's expression didn't change, but Sarah buried her face against her brother's shoulder. Natalie's heart ached for them. They looked so small and lost. She crouched down, bringing herself to their eye level, though she stayed where she was and didn't approach. "Hello, Thomas." "Hello, Sarah. I'm very pleased to meet you both. I've heard you're very good at helping Mrs. Rodriguez. That's wonderful." Thomas stared at her silently. Sarah peeked out from behind her brother, one brown eye visible. "I had a long journey to get here," Natalie continued in the same calm, friendly tone. "I came all the way from Philadelphia on a stagecoach. Have you ever ridden in a stagecoach?" Sarah shook her head slightly, still mostly hidden. "It's very bumpy and loud," Natalie said. "And dusty. I think I swallowed about a pound of dust between here and New Mexico. It made me very thirsty." "There's water inside," Thomas said suddenly, his voice small but clear. "That's very helpful, thank you," Natalie said. "I appreciate you telling me." It was a tiny breakthrough, but she'd take it. She straightened up as Mrs. Rodriguez gathered her own children, preparing to leave. "You need anything, you send Diego to fetch me," Mrs. Rodriguez told Natalie quietly. "Those children are grieving, but they are good little ones. And Mr. Thornton, he is a good man, patient and kind." "Thank you," Natalie said sincerely. "I may take you up on that offer." After the Rodriguez family left in their own wagon, an awkward silence settled over the homestead. Lawrence began unloading supplies, and Natalie wasn't sure what to do with herself. The children had retreated fully into the cabin, and she was suddenly, acutely aware that she was a stranger here, inserting herself into a fragile situation. "Let me show you inside," Lawrence said, carrying her trunk. "It's not fancy, but it's solid." The cabin's interior was dim and surprisingly cool. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A rough wooden table and chairs stood near the kitchen area, where shelves held basic supplies and cooking implements. Two doors led to what must be bedrooms. "Children sleep in there," Lawrence said, nodding to one door. "I've been taking the other room. There's a cot in the barn where I can sleep, and you can have the room. It's more appropriate until we're married proper." Natalie hadn't even thought about the sleeping arrangements, but of course they couldn't share a room before the wedding. "That seems reasonable. Thank you." He set her trunk down and stood awkwardly, clearly unsure what to say next. The children were nowhere to be seen, probably hiding in their room. "Mr. Thornton," Natalie began. "Lawrence, please. If we're going to be married, seems silly to be formal." "Lawrence, then. And you should call me Natalie." She took a breath. "I think we should establish some expectations." "I meant what I said about being partners. I'll handle the household, the cooking, the children's education, anything that needs doing inside and around the immediate homestead. But I want to know about the ranch, how it operates, what the plans are. I want to understand the life I'm becoming part of." Lawrence nodded slowly. "That's fair. I can teach you about the cattle, the land, all of it, and I'll respect your judgment on the house and the children. You clearly know more about raising kids than I do." "We'll figure it out together," Natalie said. "Now, those children haven't come out of their room. I'm going to start making supper. Is there anything I should know about what they will or won't eat?" "Sarah doesn't like beans," Lawrence said. "Tommy will eat anything, but he eats so slow his food gets cold. And they both miss their mother's cooking, though I don't know what she used to make." Natalie's throat tightened at the pain in his voice. "I'll do my best." She explored the kitchen area, finding it better stocked than she'd expected. Flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, canned vegetables, even some spices. She could work with this. Cooking had always calmed her, the familiar rhythms of chopping and stirring giving her hands something to do while her mind settled. She decided on a simple stew, using the salt pork and canned tomatoes, adding wild onions she found hanging in a bunch. While it simmered, she mixed up cornbread, grateful that the oven was already warm from whatever Mrs. Rodriguez had been cooking earlier. Lawrence came in and out, finishing the unloading, bringing fresh water from the well, doing small repairs she could hear him making outside. He moved quietly, like he was trying not to disturb her, and she appreciated the consideration. When the food was ready, she called everyone to the table. Lawrence came immediately, but the children's door stayed closed. He started to get up, but Natalie shook her head. "Let me try something." She walked to their door and knocked gently. "Supper's ready. I made stew and cornbread. You don't have to eat if you're not hungry, but I'd like you to come sit at the table with us anyway. Even if you just want to sit there and be quiet, that's all right." No response at first, then the door cracked open. Thomas peered out suspiciously. "What kind of stew?" "Salt pork with tomatoes and onions. No beans." He considered this, then took Sarah's hand and led her out. They sat at the table silently, and Natalie dished out servings, making sure to give them smaller portions so they wouldn't feel overwhelmed. The meal was quiet, awkward, but nobody cried or ran away, which Natalie counted as a victory. Thomas ate mechanically, each bite carefully chewed. Sarah mostly pushed her food around, but she did eat some of the cornbread. "This is good," Lawrence said. "Real good. Thank you, Natalie." "You're welcome." "It's not like Mama's," Sarah whispered, so quietly Natalie almost didn't hear her. "I'm sure it's not, sweetheart," Natalie said gently. "Nobody can cook exactly like your mama did, but I hope it's still nice enough to eat." Sarah nodded, a tiny movement, and took another bite of cornbread. After supper, Lawrence went out to check on the cattle, and Natalie cleaned up while the children sat at the table, watching her. She hummed while she worked, an old hymn her mother used to sing, and gradually she felt them relax slightly. "You know any stories?" Thomas asked suddenly. Natalie turned, surprised. "I know lots of stories. What kind do you like? Mama used to tell us about the animals. How they got their spots and tails and things." "I know some of those," Natalie said. She dried her hands and came to sit at the table with them. "Would you like to hear one now?" Both children nodded. Natalie launched into the story of how the rabbit got its long ears, making her voice animated, using her hands to illustrate. Sarah crept closer, interested despite herself. Thomas's serious expression softened just a fraction. When Lawrence came back inside, he found all three of them at the table. Natalie in the middle of explaining how the bear got its short tail, the children actually smiling. He caught Natalie's eye over their heads, and the gratitude in his expression was unmistakable. She smiled back, feeling something warm unfold in her chest. Maybe this could work. Maybe they could actually build something real here. The next few days fell into a tentative routine. Natalie woke before dawn to start breakfast, learning the rhythms of the household. Lawrence worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, checking cattle, doing the 100 tasks a ranch required. The children orbited around Natalie cautiously, still grieving, still uncertain, but slowly beginning to trust. She started teaching them their letters in the afternoons, using a slate and chalk Lawrence brought from town. Thomas was quick to learn, hungry for the structure that lessons provided. Sarah was too young for formal education, but she liked drawing pictures and listening to stories. At night, after the children were asleep, Lawrence and Natalie would sit outside on the porch, talking quietly. He told her about the ranch, his plans to expand the herd, the challenges of water rights and rustlers, and the harsh climate. She told him about Philadelphia, her mother's illness, the suffocating feeling of being dependent on her sister's reluctant charity. "I always thought I'd marry for love," Natalie admitted one evening, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Like in the novels. Some handsome stranger would sweep me off my feet." "Is that what you wanted?" Lawrence asked. "I thought so. But love in those stories is all passion and drama. Nobody talks about what comes after, the daily work of building a life together. Maybe the practical approach makes more sense." Lawrence was quiet for a moment. "My parents had an arranged marriage. Their families were neighbors, and it made sense to join the ranches, but they grew to love each other deeply. I remember my father looking at my mother like she was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen, even after 30 years together." "That's a nice thought," Natalie said softly. "I think people can grow into love," Lawrence said, "if they're willing to put in the work, to really see each other and care about each other's happiness. It doesn't have to start with lightning bolts." Natalie glanced at him in the darkness, seeing his profile outlined against the lamplight from inside. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, all sharp angles and sun-weathered skin. But more than that, he was kind and patient and honest. Those were things you couldn't see in a photograph or glean from letters. Those were things you learned by living alongside someone. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't have to start with lightning bolts." The circuit judge came through Winslow 2 weeks after Natalie's arrival. Lawrence drove into town early to make arrangements, and when he returned, he looked nervous. "Judge Murphy can marry us tomorrow afternoon if you're willing," he said. "I know it's quick, but he won't be back through for another 3 months, and it seems better to make things official." Natalie's heart raced, but she nodded. "Tomorrow is fine." That night she pressed her one good dress, a simple blue cotton she'd been saving for the wedding. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and neat, the best she had. She braided her dark hair carefully, trying to look presentable. In the morning, Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with her daughters, bringing wildflowers for a bouquet and ribbons for Natalie's hair. "A bride should have some beauty on her wedding day," Mrs. Rodriguez said warmly, fussing over Natalie like a mother hen. "Even a practical wedding deserves some joy." The Rodriguez girls were sweet, weaving flowers into Natalie's braid and chattering excitedly about the ceremony. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and Natalie found herself actually feeling excited rather than just nervous. The children were confused by all the activity. "Why is everyone acting strange?" Thomas asked. "Miss Natalie and I are getting married today," Lawrence explained, kneeling down to Thomas's level. "That means she'll be staying here permanently, becoming part of our family." "Will she be our mama now?" Sarah asked, her little face uncertain. Lawrence looked to Natalie, clearly unsure how to answer. Natalie crouched down too, taking Sarah's small hands in hers. "I can't replace your mama, sweetheart. She loved you so much, and she'll always be your mama. But I'll be here to take care of you and love you the best I can." "Would that be all right?" Sarah thought about this seriously, then nodded. "I think Mama would like you." Natalie had to blink back tears. "Thank you, Sarah. That's very kind." The wedding took place in the small church in Winslow, with Judge Murphy officiating and Mrs. Rodriguez's family as witnesses. Thomas and Sarah sat in the front pew, scrubbed clean and dressed in their best clothes, watching solemnly. Natalie stood beside Lawrence in her blue dress, the wildflower bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. Lawrence wore clean denims and a white shirt, his hair freshly combed, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. Judge Murphy kept the ceremony simple and dignified. When he asked if Lawrence would take Natalie as his lawfully wedded wife, Lawrence's "I will" was strong and clear. When he asked Natalie the same question, she looked into Lawrence's hazel eyes and saw not passion or drama, but something steadier and possibly more valuable: respect, kindness, and the promise of partnership. "I will," she said. They exchanged simple gold bands that Lawrence had purchased in town, and when Judge Murphy pronounced them married, Lawrence kissed her gently, respectfully, just a brief press of lips that still made her blush. Mrs. Rodriguez had arranged a small celebration back at the ranch, with tamales and sweet bread and lemonade. The Rodriguez children played with Tommy and Sarah, and for a little while, the homestead rang with laughter and life. As the sun set and their guests departed, Natalie found herself alone with Lawrence for the first time as his wife. They stood on the porch, watching the Rodriguez wagon disappear down the road. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," Lawrence said quietly. "Give you time to adjust. No rush on anything." Natalie touched his arm, surprised by her own boldness. "We're married now, Lawrence. You don't have to sleep in the barn." He looked at her searchingly. "I don't want you to feel pressured. This marriage is about partnership and respect, remember? That includes respecting your comfort." "I appreciate that," Natalie said honestly. "But we're building a life together. That means sharing it fully. I'm nervous, but I'm not unwilling." Lawrence covered her hand with his, warm and calloused. "Then we'll figure it out together, just like everything else." That night, after the children were asleep, Natalie and Lawrence shared the bedroom for the first time as husband and wife. There was awkwardness, certainly, the strangeness of intimacy with someone still mostly unknown. But there was also tenderness, Lawrence's patience as he let her set the pace, the surprising sweetness of discovering this new aspect of their relationship. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Lawrence's steady breathing beside her, Natalie felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't the passionate love of novels, but it was real and solid and growing. She could build a life on this foundation. The weeks that followed were busy and full. Natalie threw herself into making the cabin a real home, sewing curtains from fabric Lawrence brought from town, planting a small garden near the house, teaching the children not just their letters but songs and games her mother had taught her. Lawrence worked tirelessly on the ranch, but he made time every evening to eat supper with them, to hear about the children's lessons, to ask Natalie's opinion on decisions about the herd or the land. He kept his word about treating her as a partner, and she found herself falling into an easy rhythm with him, their conversations growing deeper, more personal. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the wedding, Natalie was hanging laundry when she heard shouting from the direction of the cattle. She dropped the sheet she was holding and ran toward the sound, her heart pounding. Lawrence was near one of the corrals, along with Diego Rodriguez, both of them focused on a cow that was clearly in distress. The animal was on its side, bellowing, and even from a distance Natalie could see something was wrong. "What happened?" she called. "She's calving," Lawrence shouted back. "But the calf's positioned wrong, we're trying to turn it." Natalie had no experience with birthing cattle, but she'd helped deliver her sister's youngest child when the midwife was delayed. Birth was birth, regardless of species. She hurried over, assessing the situation. "Can you turn it manually?" she asked. "Trying," Diego grunted, his arm deep inside the cow. "But she is fighting me." "She's exhausted," Natalie observed. The cow's eyes were rolling, her breathing labored. "Talk to her. Keep your voice calm and steady. Animals respond to tone even if they don't understand the words." Lawrence looked skeptical, but he started murmuring to the cow in a low, soothing voice, stroking her neck. Diego continued working, and Natalie found herself coaching him the way the midwife had coached her sister. "Slow and steady. Don't force it. Work with her body, not against it." It took another 20 minutes, all of them sweating in the hot sun, but finally, Diego managed to reposition the calf, and moments later it slid free in a rush of fluid. The calf was small and wet, not moving. "It's not breathing," Lawrence said, his voice tight with worry. Natalie grabbed a piece of burlap sacking and started rubbing the calf vigorously, stimulating its circulation the way she'd seen done with newborn babies. "Come on," she muttered. "Breathe, little one. Breathe." For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the calf coughed, a wet, gasping sound, and its sides began to move. The mother cow, exhausted as she was, struggled to her feet and began licking her baby, that instinctive mother's love overriding her own exhaustion. Lawrence let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You did it." "We all did it," Natalie corrected, but she was grinning, exhilarated by the success. "Will they both be all right now?" "Should be," Diego said, looking at her with new respect. "That was good thinking, Senora Thornton. You have a steady hand in a crisis." Later, after Diego had left and the mother and calf were settled, Lawrence found Natalie washing up at the pump behind the house. He'd cleaned up too, but his shirt was still stained with blood and birth fluids. "That was amazing what you did today," he said. "Where did you learn that?" "My sister's last baby came fast. The midwife didn't make it in time, so I helped deliver him. It's not so different, really. Mothers giving birth, babies needing help to start breathing. The principle is the same." Lawrence stepped closer, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a warmth that made her breath catch. "You're remarkable, you know that. You came here alone into a completely strange situation, and you've handled everything with such grace and strength. The children adore you. You've made this house a home, and now you're out here helping deliver calves like you've done it all your life." Natalie felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm just doing what needs doing." "No," Lawrence said softly. "You're doing more than that. You're building something real here." "We're building something real." He kissed her then, not the brief, respectful kiss of their wedding, but something deeper, more genuine. Natalie kissed him back, her soapy hands coming up to rest on his shoulders, and she realized with a jolt of surprise that this feeling blooming in her chest was more than fondness or respect. She was falling in love with her husband. When they pulled apart, Lawrence was smiling, that rare, full smile that transformed his whole face. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "Even with the torn map and the changed circumstances and all of it, I'm so glad you stayed." "So am I," Natalie whispered. That night, after the children were asleep, they made love with a new intensity, the physical expression of feelings that were growing beyond their practical arrangement. Natalie felt cherished, desired, loved, and she gave all of that back to Lawrence in equal measure. In the weeks that followed, their connection deepened in countless small ways. Lawrence started kissing her goodbye in the mornings before heading out to work. Natalie began leaving small surprises for him, his favorite cornbread or a shirt she'd mended. They talked late into the night about their dreams for the ranch, for the children's future, for the life they were building together. The children blossomed under the stability. Thomas laughed more, his serious little face lighting up when Lawrence taught him to rope fence posts or when Natalie praised his reading. Sarah started calling Natalie Mama Natalie, a compromise that honored her birth mother while accepting the love Natalie offered. One evening in late September, as the brutal summer heat finally began to ease, Natalie realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week before saying anything, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely, but when 2 weeks passed with no change, she knew. She told Lawrence while they were alone on the porch after supper, the children playing a game inside. "I think I might be with child," she said quietly. Lawrence froze, then turned to her with wonder in his eyes. "Truly, I'm fairly certain. It's still early, but all the signs are there." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart racing against her cheek. "A baby," he murmured. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Natalie asked, though she could feel the answer in his embrace. Happy doesn't even begin to cover it, Lawrence said. He pulled back to look at her face, his hands cupping her cheeks. I love you, Natalie. I should have said it before now, but I love you. You've given me more than I ever dreamed of when I put that advertisement in the paper. Tears spilled down Natalie's cheeks, but they were happy tears. I love you too. I didn't expect to, but I do. So much it surprises me sometimes. They held each other as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Natalie thought about how far she'd come. From Philadelphia to Arizona, from desperate and alone to loved and building a family. The torn map that had seemed like such a disaster had actually brought her exactly where she needed to be. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into winter. Natalie continued her daily work, though Lawrence fretted and tried to make her rest more. Mrs. Rodriguez visited often, bringing advice and herbal teas, fussing over Natalie with maternal concern. Christmas came, and Natalie made it special for the children, sewing rag dolls and carving wooden toys with Lawrence's help. Thomas received his first real pocket knife, and the pride on his face when Lawrence presented it made Natalie's heart swell. Sarah got a new dress and a beautiful doll that Mrs. Rodriguez had helped Natalie make, with real hair from an old brush and a painted porcelain face. This is the best Christmas ever, Sarah declared, hugging her doll, because we're a real family now. Thomas nodded seriously. I'm glad you came, Mama Natalie, and I'm glad about the baby too. It was the most Thomas had said about his feelings since Natalie's arrival, and she had to blink back tears. Lawrence squeezed her hand under the table, his eyes bright. Winter was hard in Arizona territory, not because of snow but because of the cold nights and the constant wind. But the cabin was snug. The woodpile Lawrence had prepared kept them warm, and there was something cozy about the four of them huddled together in the evenings, reading by lamplight or playing simple games. In March, with spring beginning to green the desert, Natalie went into labor. Mrs. Rodriguez and her oldest daughter attended her, along with a midwife from town. Lawrence paced outside with Diego and the children, looking pale and worried. The labor was long but not complicated, and as dawn broke on a clear spring morning, Natalie delivered a healthy baby boy. When Mrs. Rodriguez placed him in her arms, Natalie felt overwhelmed with love for this tiny, red-faced creature who was part her and part Lawrence. "Can I bring in the family?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked with a smile. Natalie nodded, exhausted but happy. Lawrence came in first, his eyes going wide at the sight of his son. He approached the bed slowly, reverently, like he was afraid to disturb something sacred. "He's perfect," Lawrence whispered, touching the baby's tiny fist. "You're perfect. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for this gift." The children crowded in, curious and excited. Sarah climbed carefully onto the bed to see better, her eyes huge. "He's so small," she breathed. "What's his name?" Natalie and Lawrence had discussed names, but they'd waited to decide until they met their child. Looking at his little face, Natalie suddenly knew. "James," she said, "after my father, James Lawrence Thornton." Lawrence's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "That's a fine name, a strong name." He kissed her forehead gently. "You've made me the happiest man alive, Mrs. Thornton." The months after James's birth were chaotic but joyful. The baby was healthy and growing well, and Tommy and Sarah were surprisingly helpful, fetching things for Natalie and entertaining their little brother with silly faces and songs. The ranch was prospering too. The herd had grown. Lawrence had hired 2 additional hands to help with the work, and they were building a larger barn. The little homestead that had seemed so sparse and rough when Natalie first arrived was transforming into a real ranch, a place that could support a family for generations. One afternoon in June, exactly a year after Natalie had arrived in Winslow, she sat on the porch with baby James sleeping in her arms, watching Lawrence teach Tommy how to rope a fence post. Sarah was nearby, picking wildflowers and chattering to her doll, Mrs. Rodriguez rode up in her wagon, surprising Natalie with the visit. "I brought fresh bread," she called, climbing down with a basket, "and I wanted to see how everyone is doing." "We're well," Natalie said warmly. "Come sit, I'll make coffee." "No, you stay with the baby, I will make the coffee. I know your kitchen as well as my own by now." While Mrs. Rodriguez bustled inside, Natalie looked out over the land, this harsh, beautiful place that had become home. She thought about the torn map, that seeming disaster that had made her so anxious when she'd arrived. She'd worried it meant she was lost, that she'd never find her way. But Lawrence had been right, that first day when he'd helped her down from the wagon, and she'd looked around at the sparse ranch with worry in her eyes. Before she could voice her doubts, he'd said something that had stuck with her, though she hadn't fully understood it at the time. She'd looked at him with the torn map in her hand, feeling lost and uncertain, and he'd met her eyes with a steady gaze and said, "You've found your destination." At the time, she'd thought he just meant the physical place. But now she understood. Her destination hadn't been a location on a map. It had been this life, this family, this love that had grown from practical beginnings into something deep and true. Mrs. Rodriguez returned with coffee, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the children play. James stirred in Natalie's arms, making the little squeaking sounds that meant he'd wake soon, wanting to nurse. "You look happy," Mrs. Rodriguez observed. "Truly happy." "I am," Natalie said simply. "More than I ever thought possible." That evening, after the children were in bed and James was sleeping in his cradle, Lawrence and Natalie stood outside under the stars. It was their favorite time, these quiet moments alone together. "You ever regret it?" Lawrence asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Coming all this way, marrying a stranger, taking on children who weren't yours." Natalie leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and soap and the desert air. "Not for a single moment. Do you regret sending for me?" "Best decision I ever made," Lawrence said. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her waist. "I thought I was arranging a practical partnership. I never dreamed I'd find the love of my life." "The torn map brought me here," Natalie mused. "I was so upset when it ripped, so worried I'd get lost. But maybe some things are meant to be found, map or no map." Lawrence smiled and kissed her, sweet and lingering. "You were never lost, Natalie. You were exactly where you were supposed to be, heading exactly where you belonged. Here with me, with our family." As the years passed, the Thornton ranch continued to grow and prosper. Lawrence expanded the herd and acquired more land, building the operation into one of the most successful in the territory. But he never lost sight of what truly mattered, always making time for his family, treating Natalie as the full partner she was. Natalie gave birth to 2 more children, a daughter they named Caroline Rose when James was 2, and another son, Robert, 3 years after that. The house had to be expanded to accommodate everyone, and what had once been a simple 3-room cabin became a sprawling ranch house with a proper parlor and separate bedrooms for all the children. Tommy grew into a serious, capable young man who loved the ranch as much as Lawrence did. He took naturally to the work, and Lawrence began teaching him everything about running the operation, preparing him to eventually take over. Sarah became a teacher, opening a small school in Winslow and boarding in town during the week, coming home on weekends to the family that had saved her when she'd lost everything. The younger children grew up knowing only love and security, never experiencing the grief and loss their older siblings had endured. James was quiet and thoughtful like his father, Caroline was spirited and bold, and Robert was the family comedian, always making everyone laugh. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lawrence surprised Natalie with a gift. They were alone in the house, the children all occupied elsewhere, and he handed her a small wooden box. Inside was the torn map she'd arrived with, carefully preserved and mounted in a frame. "I found it in your trunk years ago," Lawrence explained. "I kept it because it seemed important, a reminder of where we started. That torn map brought you to me, Natalie. It might have seemed like a disaster at the time, but it was really a blessing." Natalie traced the ragged edge where the paper had torn, remembering her panic and fear that day in Winslow. "I thought I was lost," she said softly, "but I was exactly where I needed to be." "You found your destination," Lawrence said, echoing those words from their first meeting. "And I found mine. You." They hung the framed map in the parlor, and over the years it became a beloved family story. The children never tired of hearing about how Mama had arrived with a torn map, and Papa had promised she'd found her home. It became a metaphor they used, a reminder that sometimes what seems broken or wrong is actually leading you exactly where you need to go. As Natalie grew older, watching her children have children of their own, she often reflected on the journey that had brought her to Arizona. The desperate advertisement she'd answered, the long journey west, the shock of learning Lawrence had tried to call off the arrangement, the slow, steady growth of love between two strangers. She'd been looking for security and a home, and she'd found so much more. She'd found partnership, purpose, family, and a love that had only deepened with time. The practical arrangement had become a great romance, not because it started with passion, but because it was built on respect, trust, and the daily choice to love each other well. Lawrence aged beside her, his wheat-colored hair turning silver, his face growing more lined but his eyes still warm when they looked at her. He still kissed her goodbye every morning, still sought her counsel on decisions, still held her hand under the dinner table when their children and grandchildren gathered for Sunday meals. On their 30th anniversary, surrounded by their grown children and numerous grandchildren at a celebration in the big ranch house, Tommy stood to make a toast. "Mama Natalie and Papa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me and Sarah when we'd lost everything. You gave us a home and a family and taught us what love looks like in action, not just words. You built something lasting here, not just a ranch but a legacy of love and commitment. Thank you for showing all of us what it means to choose each other, every single day." Everyone raised their glasses, and Natalie felt tears slip down her cheeks. These people, all of them connected by blood or choice, were her treasure. This life, built from such uncertain beginnings, was her greatest achievement. That night, alone with Lawrence in the bedroom they'd shared for 30 years, Natalie asked him, "Are you happy with how it all turned out?" Lawrence pulled her close, and she settled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, the same words he'd used when she'd told him about their first baby. "You took a chance on a stranger with a ranch and 2 orphan children. You stayed when you could have left. You loved when it would have been easier to just be practical. You gave me everything, Natalie. You gave me everything right back," Natalie murmured. "A home, a family, a purpose, and love, so much love." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, and Natalie dreamed of that first day in Winslow, standing in the dust with a torn map and a heart full of fear. In the dream, she could see her younger self, so scared and uncertain, and she wanted to reach out and tell her it would all be okay. More than okay. It would be beautiful. The ranch continued to thrive under Tommy's management after Lawrence decided to step back from the daily operations. He and Natalie spent their later years enjoying their grandchildren, traveling occasionally to visit Sarah in town, and simply being together. They took walks in the evening, moving more slowly than they once had but still hand in hand, still finding things to talk about after all these years. They sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. They attended church socials and anniversary celebrations for neighbors who'd become like family. Mrs. Rodriguez remained a close friend until her death at age 72, and Natalie mourned her deeply, remembering the kindness that had welcomed her to this wild territory. Diego lived several more years, and Lawrence made sure he was cared for, never forgetting how the man had been there from the beginning. As Natalie entered her 60s and then her 70s, her health remained remarkably good. She attributed it to the clean air, the active life, and the deep contentment that came from a well-lived life. Lawrence aged beside her, his body wearing from years of hard work, but his mind staying sharp and his love staying constant. Their 50th wedding anniversary was a grand celebration, with people coming from all over the territory to honor the couple who'd become pillars of the community. The territorial governor sent a letter of congratulations. The celebration lasted 3 days, with food and music and dancing. At the height of the celebration, Lawrence stood to speak, and the crowd fell silent. 50 years ago, he began, his voice still strong despite his age, I made the best decision of my life. I sent for a mail-order bride, figuring I needed help running this ranch and raising 2 orphan children. I thought I was making a practical arrangement, but God had other plans. He sent me Natalie. He turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes made Natalie's heart skip just like it had decades ago. She arrived with a torn map, looking lost and uncertain, and I told her she'd found her destination. At the time, I thought I was just talking about the ranch. But I've realized over the years that we were both finding our destination that day. Not a place, but each other. Natalie, you are my destination, my home, my heart. Thank you for 50 years of love, laughter, partnership, and grace. You've made my life extraordinary. The crowd erupted in applause, but Natalie barely heard it. She rose and went to Lawrence, and they kissed while their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren cheered. That night, lying in bed in the quiet darkness, Natalie whispered, I would do it all again. Every moment, every challenge, every joy. I'd climb on that stagecoach in Philadelphia and ride west to find you, over and over again. Even knowing your map would tear, Lawrence asked, a smile in his voice. Especially knowing that, Natalie said. Because it meant I had to trust, to take a leap of faith. And that leap brought me to you. They lived several more good years, watching their family continue to grow and thrive. James took over the ranch when Tommy retired, proving himself a capable steward of the land his parents had built. Caroline's school in Winslow became one of the best in the territory. Robert became a lawyer, representing ranchers in territorial disputes and earning respect for his fairness and intelligence. Lawrence passed peacefully in his sleep at age 79, with Natalie beside him holding his hand. His last words to her were, I love you, wait for me. Natalie mourned him deeply but without despair. They'd had 53 years together, a lifetime of love and partnership. She had their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren as living legacies of their love. And she had her memories, precious and perfect. She lived 3 more years after Lawrence's death, remaining active and engaged with her family until the very end. On a clear spring morning much like the one when she'd arrived in Winslow all those decades ago, she passed quietly in her sleep, a smile on her weathered face. Her children found the torn map still hanging in the parlor, and they made sure it was preserved and passed down through generations. It became a family heirloom, A reminder of the courage it takes to journey into the unknown, the faith required to trust in providence, and the love that can grow when two people commit to building a life together. The story of the mail-order bride who arrived with a torn map and the cowboy who told her she'd found her destination became a favorite family tale, told and retold to each new generation. It was a story of taking chances, choosing love, building something lasting from humble beginnings. Years after Natalie's death, when James's granddaughter asked him what he thought his grandmother would want her legacy to be, he thought for a long moment before answering. "I think," he said finally, "she'd want people to know that the best destinations aren't always the ones we plan for. Sometimes the map tears, the plans change, and we have to trust that we're heading somewhere even better than we imagined. And sometimes love isn't lightning bolts and grand gestures. Sometimes it's showing up, doing the work, choosing each other day after day. That's what Grandma and Grandpa had. That's what they built together." The ranch still stood, now run by the fifth generation of Thorntons, still prosperous, still a testament to what two strangers built together, starting with nothing but hope and determination. And in the parlor, carefully preserved behind glass, hung a torn map, a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys begin with what seems like a disaster, but is really destiny unfolding exactly as it should. Natalie and Lawrence's story became part of Arizona Territory's history, an example of the courage and resilience that built the West. But to their family, it was simply the story of how two people found each other against all odds, created love from practical beginnings, and built a legacy that would outlast them both. In the end, that torn map had been the perfect beginning to their story. It had taught them that you don't always need perfect directions to find your way home. Sometimes you just need courage, faith, and the willingness to trust that, when you arrive somewhere unexpected, it might be exactly where you were meant to be all along. And when Natalie had stood in the dust of Winslow with that torn map in her trembling hands, looking at Lawrence with fear and hope mixing in her heart, he'd spoken a truth neither of them fully understood yet. You found your destination. He'd been right. Not because of the ranch or the location, but because she'd found him, found their family, found a love that would endure through trials and triumphs, through decades of partnership, through a lifetime of choosing each other. That was the real destination. Not a place on a map, whole or torn, but a home built in two hearts that beat as one. A love that started as a practical arrangement and grew into something extraordinary. A family that spanned generations and kept growing. Roots deep in Arizona soil and branches reaching toward endless possibility. And every spring, when wildflowers bloomed across the desert and the air carried the promise of new beginnings, the Thornton family remembered the woman who'd arrived with nothing but courage and a torn map, and the man who'd seen past the practical arrangement to the possibility of love. They remembered, and they celebrated, and they passed the story on, keeping alive the legacy of Natalie and Lawrence Thornton, who'd proved that sometimes the best love stories begin not with certainty, but with a leap of faith into the beautiful unknown.